Hey, welcome back to Guardbeardia. This is Guardbro and the Bell Dam coming at you with the next installment of the Emily Braun series. As I'm sure you guys are all aware, we do have sponsors for this channel, one of them being Skull Splitter Dice, a place where you can go and get cool metal dice packages, gifts, articles, PDFs, that kind of thing. And the other sponsor being Redcon One, an energy and protein supplement site for those of you who are seeking to get the gains that they deserve, work out, and maintain your bodies into top fighting shape, as all of you should be doing. With Skull Splitter Dice, they've just released new metal D100s, a huge half-pound metal weight that is both a playing device to help you play your games and also I would assume a good handy self-defense weapon as well. Just pick it in your fist and smash someone with it, and it'd probably get the job done. There's also the Star Splitter 11-piece dice set for those of you who like a good space theme to your dice, antique brass, the Wizard's Grimoire, the Thieves' Tools kit, the Cleric's Prayer book, etc., as well as a skull mug with horns with a couple of dice for RPGs. So if you really want to go full bad bill with that, you can do that. The other new dice sets from Skull Splitter are the Valentine's Day dice set, which includes red hearts, glitter, and gold numbering. Steampunk dice, the metal D100s, the rolling tray, Andrar's Fury, which look pretty cool, strawberry iced, ice venom, phase glimmer if you're into Fae, and all kinds of new dice sets. It's pretty cool looking. The Ifrit's Eye is pretty cool. It's like little fire gems almost. These sets and more are available on Skull Splitter Dice. From the splash page of Redcon 1, you can see there's still the Total War pre-workout, the Big Noise, the Moab, as well as Fubar Energy and Mental Trigger, which is a focus formula to help you stay focused through the day. As well, there are such things with the Total War pre-workout variety case. It's kind of a ready-to-drink pre-workout. You can kind of pop in your bag and off you go. The Total War Kenny Omega V-Trigger pre-workout. A lot of words there. A lot of words. As well, there are new flavors for the meal replacement powders, vanilla milkshake and fudge brownie, which is more or less dessert for protein. And of course, there's always the standbys, the protein powders, the isotope whey powder, the green beret for you vegans out there, and the ration whey powder. There's also ration packs, muscle builders, fat burners. There's all kinds of things on Redcon 1 that may fit the need you're looking for. So by all means, stop by Redcon 1 and see if there's something there that you need. Protein bars, protein drinks, supplements, everything you need can be found on Redcon 1. And you'll save money doing it with the discount code down below in the comment section / description section / whatever the hell YouTube calls it. Anywho, enough of this. On to the story.
Chapter 10. Adrift Together. Emily slid the seat of her pants across the battered booth cushion of Calamity Mame's corner table, thudding her helmet onto the scarred tabletop with a grunt. Despite the weather, she was sweaty, having been nervously checking over her shoulder the entire ride to make sure the old man wasn't following her. She couldn't shake the feeling that something off was about the man, even more so than the hallway that never ended and held nothing but the footwear of the slain. Emily fussed with her braid as she realized it was fuzzy with loose strands of hair, and conceded defeat as she realized that there was no salvaging it without ample applications of conditioner and water. Tootie strutted up just as she was tying her red mop of a mane into a messy bun, and the elf popped her chewing gum with a glint of teeth. "Geez, Emily, you look like you've been running away from a herd of thirsty boys. What's the rush?" Emily looked up at Tootie with a forced smile, tying off her bun with a flourish. "No boys here, just a weird old dude." "Oh? Is he the one with money or the kind that look through windows?" Emily scoffed. "One that collects shoes and old gear, apparently." Tootie bounced on her heels as she giggled. Oh, you mean Mr. Toller? He's an okay guy. Tips well and keeps the end of his fingers away from my thighs. She giggled again and pulled out a notepad from her apron, twisting back and forth on the heels of her combat boots in a sultry, idle sway. Do you want a coffee or something? Emily breathed out whisperingly as she tried to settle her voice and nerves. Sure, Tootie. Maybe a bowl of soup, too. Just grab whatever. She leaned back into the worn leather of the seat. It was the oddest thing about the place, as every seat was actually made from full cowhide, not the cheap plastic stuff that other diners used. Yeah, sure thing. I'll be right back with your coffee. Tootie tapped the end of her long-nailed finger on the tip of Emily's nose before flouncing away with a flourish, scooting and dancing through the tables as if she were a mouse moving its way through a hallway of traps. If the traps had fingers, that is. Emily wiggled her nose and had to guess she had been handling salads earlier, as the end of her nose smelled of cheddar cheese and French dressing. She rubbed her hands on the front of her face with a rasp of flesh on flesh and sighed before bringing her hands back down to the tabletop. She thought of nothing for a while, simply processing just what the hell had happened before, then looked down at where the torque was resting on her clavicles. What was that thing? She asked it, leaning forward on her elbows as she did.
An artifact that shouldn't even be possible to bring here,
the torque replied, and she felt its stir in distress.
An Orruk should be only bound to the world it was keyed to. It shouldn't even be fathomable to bring one from one world to another. They were bound by the first gods to never leave their plane and only be activated by its keykeeper in times when needed. The fact it's here, on this plane, the repercussions are astronomical.
What do you mean? Are the plane police going to show up all of a sudden like an episode of Cops?
No, nothing like that. The keykeeper is linked to it and forever bound to chase it. Keykeepers are immensely powerful entities that are designed from the ground up to protect their Orruk. It could also spell disaster for the world the Orruk is bound to, as both feed off of each other and give each other power. The world that Orruk is from could be dead or dying, and there's no telling either way. It could also summon its keeper here, which would be like a human falling upon a hill of ants with an iron boot to retrieve the crumb they carried away.
So it's a bad thing that it's here, then. She felt the torque shudder against her flesh.
Very bad.
Both Emily and the torque jumped as Tootie thumped down a steaming mug of coffee, and Emily heaved in a breath as Tootie set down her cream and sugar. Tootie! Jesus, elf girl, you need to wear bells. Tootie just tittered with quiet laughter, finally setting down Emily's bowl of corn chowder in front of her along with a large spoon. If I wore bells, all the boys would just think Christmas was coming every day of the year. Oh, is that yours too? Tootie pointed towards the end of the booth that was attached to the wall, and Emily followed the finger with her eyes. Her heart clenched in her chest as she saw the small brown paper package innocently sitting on the tabletop, resting there as if she had put it there herself next to her helmet. Something you found in Nevada? Surprised little Ogle Dog will let you take it to lunch. Emily did not reply, feeling the torque tightening around her neck in its own fear like a cat recoiling from the sight of distant hounds, and her eyes bore down onto the package. She could not feel the same revulsion, the same wrongness that she had felt before when the large stone had been unwrapped, but her mind buzzed with the all-too-recent memory of it. She felt a manicured nail poke into her cheek and she jerked again, having been staring at the stone as if it were an SCP lurking in the corner of a hallway. Hey, Emily, you in there, doll? She shook her head curtly and looked up to Tootie, then back over towards her helmet. The little brown package hadn't moved, and she reached her hand towards the mug of coffee. Yeah, sorry, Tootie, I'm here. Yeah, I found it in Nevada, holding on to it for a client. Huh, what's it look like? Tootie raised a brow and reached out with her hand, leaning over the table and grasping for the little brown package with curious fingers. She was halted by Emily's hand, snapping down around her wrist with feverish strength and a clasp of flesh. And Tootie looked down at Emily with worry-bright eyes. Don't touch it, Emily hissed out in a hushed voice, and Tootie saw the fear in the human's pupils, the strain in the corner of her eyes, and the warble of dread on her voice. Don't touch it, Tootie. Don't ever touch it. Emily was not even sure what made her say these things to Tootie, but something inside of her lizard brain somehow knew to make sure the elf didn't touch the little package at all, not even the paper. Tootie swallowed hard and looked from Emily to the small brown package, then back to those worried eyes that bore into her. Okay, Emily, I won't touch it. I'm sorry. I didn't mean to. Tootie's eyes were beginning to fill with embarrassed tears as some of the other customers were looking around, trying to figure out as to why her voice had gone up a few octaves in a manner unaccustomed to her usual nature. Emily realized she had been squeezing Tootie's wrist hard enough that it left a mark when she released, and she shuddered out of breath, now worried more for Tootie than she was of Tootie touching the stone. Oh shit, Tootie. I'm so sorry. I didn't mean... I'm sorry. Emily reached out for Tootie, but the elf pulled away, clutching her wrist in her other hand and holding it to her chest protectively. No, it's okay. I should have asked. I don't know what it is. I should have asked. Tootie's heeled boots clacked away as she made a beeline for the kitchen to get away from the curious eyes of the diners, and she was followed by multiple other waitresses that had been working that day. Emily looked around at the other customers in the eatery and saw that they were all staring daggers at Emily, and she lowered her own eyelids at them while picking up her helmet. She thumped it down on top of the stone to hide it from view, then bared her teeth at anyone who was still finding it necessary to be looking in her direction. The amateur divers who knew of her looked away quickly, deciding that their sandwiches or fried chicken was more important at the moment. But the more seasoned and veteran diners still bored their eyes on Emily. They did not stare at her for what she did to Tootie, at least not completely, but stared at her because they were in the belief that she had dragged or mistakenly brought something dangerous into Calamity Mames. It's fine, Emily growled darkly, and one by one the veteran divers went back to their own coffee or food. They did not, however, leave it alone completely, as from time to time they would dart their eyes toward her helmet, hiding the thing that she deemed too dangerous for an elf to touch. Tootie never came back to Emily's table, as instead a human waitress named Ruby had taken up the task of taking care of Emily. Despite the fact that Tootie kept working around Emily, the elf never got close enough to her table for an apology to be issued. Feeling worse than she had before, Emily finished her coffee, her bowl of soup, then picked up her helmet in order to leave. As she went down to grab the brown paper-wrapped stone, she found that it was no longer there. Emily let out a harsh hiss and turned feverishly around in place, her eyes glinting as she tried to see where the little package had fallen. Even after checking under the table and almost flipping a booth seat over to look under it, she found that there was not fiber nor twine to be found of the stone, and she gritted her teeth. What kind of fucking cursed wild goose chase is this shit? She rumbled and rapped her helmet on the table before storming out of the diner with a wind of fury and frustration. The orcish police officer that normally tried to speed trap people on the way towards the highway didn't even bother to turn on his lights as Emily roared past at high speed, having spied the Zundep from a distance and decided he would mind his own business for the day. If a World War II motorbike was going 80 miles per hour in a 35, there was probably a good reason for it, and he didn't want to find out what the reason was from a woman like Emily. In general, he found the female human terrifying simply from the overall aura she put out, and thought that she was nothing like the stories of kind-hearted human women he had heard of. Emily roared along the road, leaning over her fuel tank and leaning further left or right depending on just whom she was zipping around. The family of satyrs crammed into a Volvo station wagon almost passed out from fright when Emily roared in front of them after cutting out from behind a Dodge truck, her rear wheel nearly taking a chip of paint off of their front bumper. The mother of the gaggler of satyr children didn't even have time to honk before Emily was burning rubber away from her, her feet and hands cycling through the gears as fast as they possibly could. As she sped along the roadway, she had a sudden thought to turn around and go back to the old man's store, but the thought of having to face him again made her skin crawl. She instead thought of a better plan and continued dumping fuel into her engine, bearing down on her route home and to the one person who she knew would have some information for her. Yopuya was just opening the door to her room with a yawn when Emily sped by at a jog, the slipstream whipping the harpy's hair along with it. "Emily, where are you going?" she murmured and poked her head out of the doorway and watched Emily pound down the hallway towards Ogledok's office. Normally the employees of Ogledok's Recovery and Survey knocked on the door and looked through the glass window to see if they were nodded at for permission to enter. But today, Emily found ripping down the door with a clatter and stomping in to be a more fitting entrance for her particular needs. "What is it?" she screeched, and at her entrance, along with her voice volume, caused a fight-or-flight response from not only Ogledok but also Davin, both of them lurching up from their desks with weapons in hand. Davin lurched out of a heavy-set catnap with a CZ Scorpion seeming to materialize out of thin air, while Ogledok pulled out a curious-looking submachine gun from an attachment point from under his desk. The design looked very much like an MP5, except that it was much more angular and seemed to be inscribed with miniature runes in places that made very little sense to Emily. As Ogledock, and in the background in the other office, Davin, both turned their weapons towards Emily, Ogledock's full coffee mug slammed down onto the ground with a splash of coffee and the sound of the broken handle skittering away under his desk. Around the same time, the phone that had been in his hand bounced off the top of his desk and continued cartwheeling across the flat wooden top, coming to a rest in another empty coffee mug. "What the fuck, Emily?" Ogledock barked, his eyes wide in shock. But in Devin's office, a few glass panes away, he gave her a cheery wave without bringing down the barrel of his CZ Scorpion. "The fucking rock, Ogledock! What the fuck is the rock?" Emily roared back and slammed her helmet on the top of his desk, and it lurched into the far corner of his desk. "Rock? What fucking rock? There's no rock in here, you fucking lunatic!" Davin lowered the barrel of his Scorpion down an inch and tilted his head towards Emily, looking a big, brawly, but confused puppy. "The rock that was in Tom's old fucking packs, Augie. The big fucking rock that is apparently able to follow people?" Sensing that Emily was not about to charge at him and try and strangle him with the hands he so much enjoyed, he lowered his own barrel and took his selector switch from a rune-etched full auto setting to safe. "What are you talking about? Tom didn't collect rocks. That's your Puya's thing. And what the hell did you do to my desk?" Emily looked down and saw that she had slammed her helmet down with such force that she had embedded a letter opener down into the wood, having spiked it on top of its holder and driving it down like a hammer. "Oh, my bad. Wait, no, fuck you, Augie! What the hell was Tom doing with a magic rock?" "What magic rock, crazy lady?" Ogledock bit out furiously while wiping his palm across his forehead. The colors currently wafting across his skin were ones of rage and confusion, and he glared heavily at her. "You know, the damn teleporting stone of death and destruction, apparently. It even freaks out my necklace. And some old creepy dude had a magical hallway full of boots and said a bunch of weird stuff about Tom and him and something about hospitality." Emily's voice drew down in volume as she placed her hands on her hips and drew in a ragged breath. When she looked up to Ogledock, he was no longer angry per se, but more furiously bewildered. "Mr. Toller has a magical boot hallway?" he asked in a quiet tone of confusion, and Emily cut across him. "Forget about the goddamn boot hallway. What about the rock?" She roared and slammed her fists down in the air as she spoke, rocking her shoulders and chest. Ogledock set his weapon down on his desk, still not sure if he needed it, and ran a hand through his hair with a ripple of color. "Emily, what the hell are you talking about? What rock? If it was in Tom's bags, you would have it on you, right?" Emily blanched, then furrowed her eyes as she began turning on the spot in his office. Okay. It popped up on the table with Tootie when we were both looking at it. Ogledock, look at me and not around me." She strode towards a single corner of the office while Ogledock sputtered and began trying to look wherever she was looking. "What the hell are you doing, Emily? You can't just kick in my door and—" Emily ripped open her motorcycle jacket zipper and pulled up her sweaty undershirt, exposing her toned stomach and just the barest edge of her sports bra. "Look at me, Augie!" To say that the breath was whipped from Ogledock's lungs would be putting it lightly, as his eyes locked onto Emily's flesh and the area around her belly button. And the only thing to break the crushing silence was the snorting from Davin as he bent over in buckling laughter that shook his back. Davin couldn't hear much except for bits and pieces, but when Emily suddenly jerked up her shirt, it caught him so off guard that it elicited great gales of stupid laughter. Ogledock opened his mouth to speak, blinked a few times, and turned shades of purple and pink so rapidly that the ripple of movement looked like that of a cuttlefish. When he finally found his voice, he had been staring at Emily's toned stomach for almost a whole minute. Emily? What?" Emily closed her eyes, then opened them slowly, looking up and around the room. Ogledock watched her as well, following her gaze, then saw her eyes lock on something just by his shoulder. Ogledock raised his eyebrows, almost afraid to look as she slowly lowered her shirt and began to tuck it back in. She never took her eyes off the stone as she spoke, her voice dark with mourning and suspicion. "That magical rock, Augie." Ogledock slowly turned his head, suspecting something to be looking back out at him once he finally turned the full 90 degrees, but instead came eye to twine with a small brown package instead. He brought his lips up in a nervous smile, mouth slightly open as he flicked his eyes from the small paper-wrapped parcel to the dark eyes of Emily. "This thing?" "Yes, Augie. That thing," Emily murmured threateningly. And she never took her eyes off the small package the entire time the two spoke, Davin, deciding the two weren't going to kill each other, set down his scorpion and went back to playing his MMORPG on company time. Ogledok slowly backed away from the little brown paper ball of mystery and leaned back against his desk, and he looked at it with a squinted eye. I didn't put that there. This is also the first time I've seen this. Emily finished tucking in her shirt, and she saw the changeling flick his eyes from the thing on the shelf to her pants button, then back to the shelf. She cleared her throat. You didn't know he had it? No, Tom never even spoke about this, whatever it is. Hell, he never even kept anything he usually found. He had this bundled in one of his bags? What did Mr. Toller say about it? A single phrase came fluttering into her mind as she thought back to when she had been pushing past the door and rushing towards her bike. A few words that she had somehow overheard.
She is calling to you.
Not much. Just that Tom was obsessed with it. Something about how it was here before the big flood. Something about it being a key to the human race. Stuff like that. She said flatly and placed a hand on her stomach. Had he been staring at her belly button the entire time? Of all the places to look. Mr. Toller said that? I knew he had a thing for old boots and had some fun stories, but he never mentioned any of this kind of shit to me, let alone Tom saying anything. Is this why he went to the Dakotas again? Emily nodded. He said Tom was hunting some kind of monster or something like that. I have no idea if they're connected or anything. I didn't really stick around to find out every tidbit about Tom's life ambitions during the whole creepy fucking vibe he was putting out. Plus, he showed me the rock and had sketched me out. Popped up in the diner. I never took it with me, but there it was next to my helmet as if it wanted to be included or some shit. Ogledok reached for it, but Emily felt no need to warn him as she had with Tootie. But nonetheless her stomach curled in on itself as his fingers wrapped around the brown paper wrapping. Her voice was dark and warning, as if he were holding a grenade with only a dry spaghetti noodle holding the spoon in place. Carefully, Augie, it feels wrong when you look at it. Don't unwrap it or anything, just leave it as it is. Ogledok jerked his head back around to Emily, and he furrowed his brows at her tone of voice. It was odd to him to hear her talk like that, as it was never a tone Emily had used before. Angry? Sure. Teasing? Usually. But never in such a dangerous tone as this. He heeded the warning, nonetheless, and set it down on his digital reader. Well, let's have a look at where it came from at least. This thing rarely ever fails. Holy shit! Davin, hearing the sudden outburst, turned his head just enough to see Ogledok's computer and monitor explode into a cascade of sparks and pieces of fan plastic. He would have gotten up to help, but he was currently healing for a 40-man raid, and Ogledok was a big boy. He could handle himself. Emily and Ogledok screeched as sparks spat and danced through the air, the high-powered magical components spinning themselves into insane RPMs and power output. The fans were turning so fast that they came apart like miniature fragmentation grenades, cracking apart and shooting out into the room. To Ogledok's credit, he stood in front of Emily, arms wide, and took a flying ram stick to the chin as the computer tower came apart at the seams with a death-rattling crescendo. The husk continued to flick and spit colored sparks here and there, while light blue smoke slowly trailed up from where the technomantic CPU had been socketed. Ogledok reached up and pulled a small chunk of ram stick from his chin and side, flicking the little shard of bloody plastic down to the top of his desk. His hair was rippling with colors of green, while the tinges of orange and red were beginning to move their way back into his cheeks and eyes. Ogledok looked down at the smoking ruin of his computer, then down to the innocent-looking package that still rested on his reader pad. He reached down, plucking it up with his hand and holding it in front of his face. Well, that only deepens the mystery, doesn't it? Emily's mouth was partially parted as she looked down from the self-deconstructed computer to Ogledok, pointing lamely from one to the other. Is that a normal thing to happen? That happens all the time, right? Davin didn't even move. No, this is a first, he murmured, and held the brown paper-wrapped rock aloft. Davin looked over his shoulder again for a moment as well as his raid rested, and he smugly wiggled his hand. Apparently his healing was on point today despite the chaos. Last time the program even had a hard time running a relic was when an old employee of mine believed he had come across the toe of a god, Ogledok said, setting the small package back down on his broken plastic-covered desk. Emily lightly touched her fingertips together, a worried smile on her face. The toe of a god? What happened then? The god came and got it back, and the employee was rewarded with leaving this plane. Ogledok rubbed his hand up and down his face as he leaned his rump against the desk, folding an arm under the other. What else did Mr. Toller say? Anything else? Emily wasn't sure if it was the right thing to do, all things considered, but she leaned forward towards Ogleduck as she spoke in a hushed and nervous tone. That she is calling me? She? What kind of she? Unseelie court she? Seelie court she? Those who watch from the shadows she? There are lots of she's that can take an interest in somebody, Emily. Emily shrugged. I don't know. I didn't even catch most of what he said when I was leaving. Like I said, I wasn't keen to stick around and find out due to the vibe he was putting out. Ogleduck closed his eyes and breathed in deep before opening them again. Mr. Toller aside, Tom knew it was highly against the rules to keep objects like this in the main building. He was also a part of some kind of cult or order, but he never elaborated, and I was never able to dig up anything else on it. The only thing I could ever get a read on was his necklace. Looked like some kind of shield, but he always had it inside of his shirt. Emily spluttered and snapped her fingers. A shield, right? With a little cross in the center and with a solid-colored background? Ogleduck looked at Emily and cocked his head. I always suspected there was a little cross on it. It looked like a kite shield whenever I got a glimpse of it. Mr. Toller had the same necklace. It had a little cross in the middle of it, and some of the boots had other crosses on them. Ogleduck pulled out a sheet of paper from his desk drawer and reached over for a pen. Do you remember what they looked like? Emily slowly blew air out from her cheeks as she remembered back to the little patch on the duffel bag, as well as the one that was around the old man's neck. I think so. I can at least remember the general shape. Ogleduck placed the pen in her hand and gestured towards the paper, and as Emily took the pen to it, the changeling turned and looked at his ruin of a computer, and he made a pained sound in the back of his throat. Emily ignored the sounds of his soul rattling and tried to concentrate on the shape of the cross, its small darts on each blade, and how each piece of the cross came down to a point near the center. When she was done, she tossed the pen down on top of the desk and placed her hands on her hips, looking down at the little shape she had drawn. Ogleduck leaned forward and looked down at it, his lips pressed together as he studied the shape. I was expecting more. Doesn't help that you're not the next Da Vinci. Emily reached over and grasped onto his pointed ear. I was under duress. Ow! Yeah, I get it. Let go of me! Ogleduck swatted her hand away and puffed an angry breath from his nose while his cheeks flared red. His ear and jaw glowed pink for a moment. Anyway, this looks like the Cross of Malta. The island itself was swallowed up during the First Rise, and the Order was more about charities anyway. In comparison to the Knights Templar, it's like a 2 on the conspiracy scale. However, at the same time, they are based off of the Knights Hospitaller, but they were all about taking care of wounded soldiers in hospitals and stuff. Emily blinked a few times at Ogleduck before looking down at the cross she drew. For a changeling, you sure know a lot about knightly orders. Changelings can read, Ogleduck replied, and sat down in his chair, knee-thumping the buttstock of his customized MP5. Emily gestured towards the submachine gun. And also know gunsmithing? Oh, no, these are standard issue, Ogleduck said tiredly, finding himself suddenly devoid of energy as he patted the MP5. Custom issue where? Ogleduck popped his eyes open from their half-lidded resting area and looked up to Emily, who was giving him an odd look. Ogleduck's eyes twinged with green, then yellow, and he looked away from Emily, casting his eyes towards the package. Old job. Anyway, what about this little thing? You said it was following you? What was your old job? Emily asked flatly, not letting Ogleduck off the hook so easily from this little nugget of information. Ogleduck's tone was derisive. Not babysitting female humans who kept bringing dangerous things home like stray kittens made of shrapnel grenades. Now you said it was following you? Emily glowered at Ogleduck for a moment as he deflected away from her question, but figured she could circle back around to it at another time. So far, yes. It followed me to the cafe, then here, so that's twice today. But I don't know anything else about it. But if that's the case, why didn't it follow Tom all the way to the Dakotas? It was his, wasn't it? You act like I even know what this is, Emily.
Do you trust him?
Emily started as the voice of the Torque entered her mind, louder than normal and filling her ears like a sudden rush of wind. What? Ogleduck?
Do you trust him? He is one of the Fae, a strange and tainted one if I'm smelling correctly. But if this Uruk is attaching itself to you, you may need every card in the hand available.
You know, the more you talk, the more I'm realizing that you have been lying to me about how long you were in the ground, and also, how the hell can you smell? You don't have a nose. Emily heard the Torque growl in its throat, and she smiled to herself as a predatory look came over her face. It didn't happen often, but she enjoyed the small moments where she was able to unravel a little sliver of the Torque's mystery. The smile caused Oggledock to become worried, as to him Emily was smiling for no reason whatsoever and looking at him like she was about to sink a knife between his ribs. Emily, you're making a face.
Augie, do you know a lot about otherworldly artifacts?
Emily began, folding her arms across her chest. A little. You learn a few things here and there in the business, but that doesn't explain why you're looking at me like a steak.
Do you know what an auroch is?
Oggledock shrugged. No, nothing really comes to mind. Why? Is that what this little thing of Tom's is?
Emily pinched at her nose a few times, pulling her fingers away as she thought. I know you don't like my torque, and I get that, but the thing inside of it knows what the stone is. Apparently it is called an auroch, and it's a kind of key. However, unlike other keys, this one shouldn't even be here, and its presence here is...
apocalyptic, as if Rome itself was at your door.
Is as bad as it can get. They are linked to keepers, and the keepers chase after them as far as what it has told me. They're also old creations, something about the first gods making them and gifting them to only certain entities.
Oggledock watched Emily with narrowed eyes as she spoke, still leaning his back against the chaos-strewn desk as he listened. When she mentioned the keepers, he glanced down at the stone with a wary look, and he bared a canine in a slight snarl when she finished. Emily, what in the hell is with you and running into cursed objects? You've done more to put yourself in danger than most divers do in decades of treasure hunting. He pushed off the desk with his lower back, arms crossed, and he faced Emily fully. Now, in addition to creepy-talking necklace...
I'm not creepy. Why does everyone keep calling me creepy?
Shush.
You have a equally creepy rock that is now following you around, and then there is something chasing after it? It sounds like a load of horseshit to me. If something was chasing after it, it would have gotten here by now, wouldn't it? Tom had been working here forever, and who knows how long it's been here. Emily held up a finger.
But did it follow him around? Did you ever see him quickly cover anything up or rush off?
Oggledock actually gave it a hard thought as he rifled through his memories, and he lightly rubbed the side of his thumb along his chin. No, not that I can remember, nor did anyone else ever mention it when they would go out on... Well, wait, hold on! Oggledock turned and opened the door to his office, then called out for Muriel and Tarj. He gave it another small pause of thought and called out for Yapuya as well. Once all three of the divers were quickly shuffled into the office, Emily standing off to the side to let Muriel's bulk in, Oggledock closed the door and rubbed the hearts of his thumbs together. Muriel took a look at Emily, then the desk, and her ears perked in alarm. Whoa, what the hell happened in E? Did your fucking computer blow up?
Either that or Emily shot it with a small grenade launcher,
Tarj murmured and sidestepped a single pace away from Emily, despite her being on the other side of Muriel. Yapuya did her best to seem interested, but could only manage a long yawn and a ruffle of her wing feathers. I didn't bring you in here to talk about my computer, Oggledock said, grabbing the paper wrapped auroch and setting it on the edge of the table. It's because of this. Do any of you remember seeing Tom with it? Muriel and Tarj looked at each other with a side glance and shrugged, but Yapuya gave another yawn and bent down on her knees. As she did this, she shoved her giant sport short-covered ass against Tarj's thigh, and he recoiled back against Muriel.
God damn it, Yoy!
The half-orc growled and brushed the leg of his jeans as if someone had splattered mud on them. Muriel chuckled. What's the matter? Afraid of getting cooties on him?
You don't know where that thing has been.
Tarj bit back and gave his pants another whack with the back of his hands. Yapuya didn't seem to pay them any attention, just tiredly staring at the auroch. She blinked her bleary eyes at it a few more times before she looked up at Oggledock.
This Tom's special rock.
Everyone's eyes flicked to Yapuya's form, and she tapped it with a finger.
Tom showed me rock once. Yapuya was showing him my special rocks, and he say he have special rock too. He told me never take it out of paper, always leave it wrapped up, and that it our secret.
Did he tell you what it was? Oggledock asked, and Emily leaned past Muriel's chest to look from Oggledock to Yapuya. Yapuya pursed her lips prettily and hummed in her throat as she thought. She clicked her tongue against her teeth once and leaned back up.
I think Tom call it Queen's Eye. Said it may stick to me if I touch. Yapuya thought it may be sappy, so I never unwrap and touch.
Queen's Eye? Muriel whispered to Emily. What queen? Tom could have gotten a lot of money for that if it belonged to a queen. Oggledock, remember when Barrett found that fucking mummified toe? Oggledock pointed a finger out from his crossed arms toward his computer. This is not like the toe.
Good. That guy was weird. Plus Barrett just turned to ash when he took his hand. They still sometimes find him up in the ventilation system.
Tarj murmured and looked up worriedly at the vent above them all. As the rest of them looked up towards the vent, the door swung open again as Jamesha stalked in, looking down at his forearm, his metallic skull head locked from his wrist to the exploded computer, and he gave a hiss of laughter.
Well, that explains the surge. What happened in here? You set off every alarm in the place.
Ogledock rolled his head in its socket, cracking his neck as his white mohawk waggled. There was something in Tom's bag that we put on the scanner. It caused my computer to express its feelings in a messy and violent manner. Tom's special rock! Yapuya chirped and pointed a wing claw to the little brown package. Emily, Marill, and Tarj all looked to Jamesha and spoke at the same time.
The Queen's Eye. Tom never told me of any special eye.
Jamesha said quietly, and his eyes flicked different colors as he inspected the auric with every spectrum he had available. Even a few colors Emily had not seen before. Jamesha flicked back and forth through his scanner settings before his eyes came back to their normal hue.
It would not be odd at all, except that it doesn't show up on any wavelength. It behaves like a void, which is odd, because it doesn't even show up as a rock.
Ogledock rubbed the back of his neck, rustling his hair as he did, then held out his hands. All right, so all we know is that Tom had a special rock that is now following Emily around, and... Marill snapped her head around to Emily. You what? What's with you and getting kite stuff attached to you? I swear I'm gonna wake up one day and find you replaced with a mummy or something. Emily blew out air from between her closed lips in a mild raspberry and gestured wildly with her hands. What? I was just dropping off all of Tom's shit and I ended up with this damn thing. Plus there was this weird old dude, a hallway of boots, and the rock kept making me want to sneeze. I swear I'm going out tomorrow and buying you a pair of oven mitts, then duct taping them to your wrists so you can't touch nothing. Marill growled and wrapped Emily up in a one-armed headlock, grinding her hair with her free palm in a mild nookie. Oh, come on! Emily screeched, her voice muffled by Marill's toned muscles. Despite the chaos, Tarj and Yapuya were laughing, but Jamesha and Ogledock did not share in on the mirth. As she struggled against the iron-like grip of Marill, she heard the torque chuckling in her head.
You know, I'm kinda glad you saved Marill. She reminds me more and more of someone I used to know back home.
Help me get loose! Emily yelled in her mind, but no such assistance came from the torque. Only a well-timed and rather disgustingly audible lick made Marill loosen her grip enough for Emily to slip away, and the centaur rubbed the long saliva mark along the top of Yapuya's head with a disgusted "Yuck!" leaving the harpy's hair standing up in a cowlick. Ogledock rubbed a finger on his temple as 4 of his 5 employees boiled to life in front of him, Marill trying to lick a screeching Emily back in revenge, while Yapuya, spurred on by the two, was now trying to climb up Tarj and lick him as well, much to the aggravation of the half-orc, who was holding her off with both of his arms, more or less holding her aloft. So glad we can take this seriously, Ogledock rumbled, and he looked over his shoulder at the ruin of his computer. Jamesha was almost rattling in frustration after running tests to no avail, none of his scanners able to pierce the void that seemed to surround the auric's ever-present nature. Jamesha damn near came apart at the joints when around 2200 the stone disappeared completely after he started pulling out the heavy machinery, even having a mind to drill a sample out of it in order to test further. Emily jerked her head around when she heard the crash of a micro-done gyro scan bouncing across the vehicle warehouse where Jamesha kept his workshop, the massive piece of machinery tumbling out the open roller door and onto that particular bay's landing. Emily sighed out through her nose as Marill leaned backwards from the couch, the remote still poised in her hand. Man, do you think he found something he didn't like? She asked, looking down at Emily past her nose. Emily shrugged. If I had to wager, he can't find it anymore. What do you mean? Jamesha is a robot, man. It's impossible for him to lose anything. Dude even labels his sewing needles with the barcode readers and a sensor so he can find them in carpet if need be. That, and I'm pretty sure he's blaming the thing for Tom's death, which explains why that massive drill is currently getting a moon tan. Emily puffed more air out of her nose in a laugh and turned back around towards the TV. Beside her, Marill was sprawled out in her usual centaur fashion, one arm wrapped around Emily and the other with a steel grip around the remote. Yapuya was pouting as she wanted to watch a Sailor Moon rerun marathon, but Marill refused to even let her near the remote. To Marill, anime was for lonely little nerds, and she couldn't fathom why anyone even liked watching it to begin with. Thus, Yapuya was grumpily sitting on the other side of Emily, using the human as a buffer on the couch. Beside Yopuya, Tarj was digging a spoon into a comforting pint of chunky monkey, idly spooning the banana-flavored ice cream into his mouth as he watched the movie on the large flat screen. As Frank Abnell Jr. slipped past FBI agent Carl Hanratty by pretending to be Secret Service, much to the delight of Tarj, Emily pursed her lips together. "Hey, can y'all do me a favor?" Multiple pairs of eyes looked over towards her as she cleared a space in front of her on the table. "All right, so as we can see, there's nothing on the table, right?" Tarj slowly ran his spoon along the outermost layer of his ice cream.
Yeah, except for all of your Pua's snacks and that little spot you just made.
"You're not gonna make something disappear, are you? I hate magic," Muriel asked, her voice only slightly nervous to the prospect. "Maybe Emily can magically change channel to Sailor Moon," Yopuya muttered angrily, and shot a pointed look at Muriel. No magic, just going to test a theory," Emily said calmly and rubbed her hands together. "All right, so what I need now is for everyone to look at the ceiling. Right there." Emily pointed up to a single point on the ceiling, some kind of little light socket that used to be used for lighting before Ogledock had installed more vibrant and economical LED strips in key locations. As everyone looked up, Tarj doing so while bringing a spoonful of ice cream to his lips, Emily began to count in her head.
Waiting to see if the Orc shows up?
The Torque asked, and somehow she knew it was watching the movie still. "Has it yet? I've only counted to 5.
No, nothing yet. Also, I can't believe the stone's on this guy. Who can get away with lying this much and doing what he did?
Shut up about the movie and look up at the ceiling with us. I think the Orc knows you're still watching."
I don't have eyes. How in the spires would it know?
"Just as I knew you were watching the movie. Now look up here with us before I start gluing stuff to you. I bet you would look real nice in dollar store rhinestones."
You wouldn't dare.
The Torque threatened, but Emily felt its attentions move from the movie to where she was looking. It was an odd feeling, as if she could feel a single sheet of onion skin paper shift along her body as it twisted, but it didn't cause any discomfort or unsettlement. She knew it was just them in the room at the time, as Davin had gone home, Jane had been out on a day off, and Ogledock was in his own room working on a new computer, having gotten a slew of parts rush-ordered by the very expensive same-day delivery Harpy services. As she felt the Torque's attention focus on the ceiling, she heard it. It was like the whisper of a mouse when it came to be on the coffee table, and there wasn't even a vacuum of air or a thump of its weight, just the slight crush of paper settling underneath it. The ever-quiet groan of its twine-holding, and the sudden impression on her mind that something else had come into the room. She couldn't explain the feeling, just that she knew it was here now and waiting for her. Emily slowly tilted her head down, swallowing harshly as she did, and when her eyes reached the coffee table with the little spot she had cleared, there it was, sitting there as innocently as anything ever could, and it made her blood run cold. "It's following me, isn't it?"
One time can be a fluke, second time a mystery, third time a certainty.
Emily groaned, and everyone else on the couch looked down to see the little stone had appeared. Tarj yelped and recoiled, his spoon flying over his shoulder and rattling off into the distance behind the couch. Maria was a bit more vocal about the affair, whipping her legs close to her body and pointing the remote at it. "Yo, what the fuck is that thing doing here? I thought your man should put in this little dangerous artifact container." The centaur reflexively used the arm that was around Emily's shoulders to pull the human towards her in a defensive posture. Yopuya looked down glumly at the rock, her wings still folded grumpily over one another. "Maybe Emily can make Marathon come on TV too." Tarj was still staring down at the rock in silent horror as if it were a live grenade, the pint of ice cream squeezed in a vice grip by his muscled hands. Emily gave her hand a shake to remove Marilla's braid from her face and raised a shoulder to keep a bit of space between her and the centaur so she didn't suffocate. As she looked down at the stone again, the faint words of Mr. Toller came into her mind again, and even the Torque seemed to focus on them as well.
She is calling to you.
Emily brought her hand up around Marilla's heavily muscled one to rub at her eyes tiredly. "For some reason, Tom's little special secret is following me now. I'm almost afraid to go to sleep at this point." Marill and Tarj looked to Emily with questions in their eyes, but Yopuya took the opportunity to snatch away the remote from Marill with a triumphant trill. Emily continued, leaning back against the couch and just resting her hand on Marill's arm. "You know how it is. The reluctant hero finds an artifact, some magical who's-a-what's-it visits them in their dreams, delivers a prophecy or a mission or whatever the fuck. The fact he called it the Queen's Eye makes me think something is looking at me and waiting for me to let my guard down." She sighed and closed her eyes, leaning her head against Marill's forearm as the flat screen began to come alive with the pretty guardian who fights for justice. I just wanted to make some money. I don't want to be in a prophecy. I don't want to be a hero. I just want to be me. Marill wasn't sure how to react, instead going with the simple default of wrapping her other arm around Emily's shoulders and resting her head on top of the human's, trying to comfort her. It was Tarja's words that caused them both to pop their eyes back open and glance over towards him, the half-orc continuing to eat his ice cream with a pair of chopsticks he found nearby.
It is said in my home country that those who are deemed heroes are unlucky. Prophecies and mysteries target those who are unlucky enough to find them and become bound to them. I have read some of your own folklore when I arrived here to get a lay of the land, and I was surprised how much heroism and bravado you put into your heroes. To us, they are cursed individuals, beings that bring death and destruction wherever they stride. You humans say that heroes are blessed with purpose, but we believe you are bound against your will to a duty, and you are a risk to everyone around you.
Tarj popped a chunk of ice cream into his mouth, his face placid but with dire warning in his eyes.
Right now, Emily, if you are a target of a prophecy or a divine mission, you are a threat to not only yourself, but everyone around you. I'm not trying to be mean, it's just a way of things. Prophecies, divine missions, quests, whatever you call them, you don't choose them. They choose you.
He finished off his chunky monkey ice cream and set it down on the coffee table, well away from the little brown package.
Which is why I'm here in the first place.
You told me you came here to avoid taxes, Marill said roughly, finding her throat suddenly very dry. Tarj just laughed brightly.
No, but that is also true on some levels. I was targeted by a divine quest, the same one that had killed my father and almost killed my mother from the grief. I was the main, how do humans say this, breadwinner of my household. I knew that if I tried to follow through on this quest, they would more than likely kill me just as it did my father. I have 8 siblings to look after, and I knew my mother would not be able to do it alone. So, I ran away from my divine mission, came here to work instead, make sure my family can eat since our world was one of the primarily anchored ones.
Emily blinked, her mouth slightly open as she thought. But won't it just follow you here? And doesn't that mean your world is in danger or something? Tarj snorted.
Hasn't followed me yet, and I've been here for quite a while. As for my world, my father failed to complete it, and the only thing that happened was some of our geography changed. It changed for the better in some cases, if you ask some. Finally got rid of that stretch of sand dunes that had people in a tiff.
Emily looked up at Marill and then back to Tarj. What if I run away and something bad happens?
Don't know, Emily.
Tarj mused, leaning back against the couch as he looked down at the paper-wrapped Oruk.
I knew what would happen if I left, since my dad was the one who had it first. 2 things can happen, really.
He held up one of his thick fingers.
1, nothing happens. Life continues on as normal, and the prophecy quest whatever has to find someone else to bear it forth.
He held up a second finger.
Or something awful and terrible happens. We had a few like that in my world, only 2 actually. Both of the bearers managed to complete their prophecies something like thousands of years ago. According to the star charts, we're due for another sometime soon, but my ass ain't going to be there. May as well move my mother and siblings over here at this point.
So either nothing can happen or my whole world ends. Super. So why didn't Tom deal with this bullshit then? Emily cried defeatedly, leaning her head back against the couch again. She was frustrated with the whole ordeal, as when she had first gotten into the gig of being a diver, she was under the belief it was going to be picking up a few shinies and getting mad money for it. Of course, that was not untrue up to this point, but between this stupid rock and the torque, she was reaching her limits.
Finicky things about these kind of things. You don't choose them, they choose you. Why us orcs call them a curse.
Tarj replied and dusted off the front of his jeans.
Either way, I'm going to go let your mission know where the rock went and then head to bed. Good night to you.
With little else to be said, Tarj grabbed his empty ice cream carton, stood up from the couch, and walked around it towards the back door to go let Jamesha know to stop throwing things out of his workshop. Yapuya, having been watching the flat screen the entire time, reached back and patted Emily on the knee with her wing claw.
Emily very hard to kill. Yapuya know you will be alright in end.
Emily flattened her eyebrows and looked down at the back of the harpy's head, then gave her a little nudge in the hip with her socked feet.
Thanks, Yoy.
And I don't think you're cursed. You came back for me and fought off a whole squad of goons to make sure I didn't turn in a dinner, Morrill began, pulling Emily into a tighter hug. Even if following you is a certainty of death, I'll be there beside you every step of the way. Just, try not to get me killed, you know. Both of us coming out alive would be preferable. Morrill began to ramble, her voice quickening audibly.
I mean, it's not that I wouldn't die for you, but not being dead is always the best outcome in doing anything, you know? But don't think that I wouldn't, go above and beyond as you deal with this stuff. I mean, I kind of owe you for the whole fish people thing, and...
Emily gave Morrill a pat on the arm to stop her from going any further, and she looked up at the centaur with a sad smile.
Don't worry, Morrill. I get you. I'll be sure not to lead us both to our deaths unless we absolutely need to.
Which should be the second option of two options, Morrill confirmed, giving Emily a poke in the cheek.
Of course. I just wish I had just kept to myself and not tried to help.
If I had just let Jamesha take Tom's stuff, I would never have gotten into this mess. Yeah, that'll teach you for being kind-hearted, huh? Morrill teased, giving Emily a shake. When Emily looked up into Morrill's eyes, she saw that they were ringed with worry, and Emily decided to hold back the bite she had intended to say, instead changing course for something softer.
Yeah, that'll teach me. Huh.